and I want to welcome the people online. They're nice and cozy at home, but we have a door prize. Somebody will win. So I want to tell you a little bit about EmpowerU. It started about 7 years ago, and our managing board member and founder is Dan Reginald, who also owns Frame USA, and he put this studio together for us. So we're very lucky about that. And a few things about our classes. We are all volunteer, so when we pass around the donation bucket, any little bit of money is appreciated. And also there will be questions at the end of the class. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone so the people at home and online can hear the questions. And I just want to tell you about a few more classes we have coming on. Thursday we have History of Fake News. Has anyone heard about that one? You heard about that one? Does anybody here remember Peter Bronson when he was at the Enquirer? Well, it's going to be Peter Bronson and his assessment of what fake news is, which I think will be very interesting. And then we're going to have one on sexual harassment and what you need to know. And I know a lot of people feel like they're tired of this subject, but if you're a small business owner, a medium-sized business owner, you don't have a lawyer on staff, you can't afford that. This class will help you to understand what is legally acceptable and what is not. And in this day and age, this is something that most people really want to know. It's unfortunate, but I think this will be a very timely class for a lot of people. And then Morgan's Great Raid around Cincinnati. If we have a lot of Civil War buffs around, this is a great one. I really never heard about this raid before. This Confederate Brigadier General John Hunt was made a raid around Cincinnati that largely went unnoticed because it was during Gettysburg. So I think this will be a really great class too. And then open mic night. We have any musicians here? Anybody got friends that are musicians? Okay, well, we're gonna have open mic night where you can bring your songs and dance and you can win $100. So maybe you wanna become a musician. I don't know. And then we've got a few more going on after that. I won't go through them all, but I just wanted to let you know the ones that are coming up soon. And I will introduce our amazing community relations manager, Betty Overstreet.
Thank you, Nita. Before I introduce our speaker, we're going to draw a ticket for our door prize. What? Okay, a few more tickets coming. I will tell you though, we may be drawing tickets for a little while because there's a lot more tickets in here than there are people. So maybe we'll get lucky and pull out a good one right away. Okay, I can go. I'm going to ask you if you would to pull the ticket for me. Last three numbers, 048. No 048. One down. 038. Two down. I'm going to try somebody else. 071. Oh, we got one. Can I have your name, please? Sharon. Sharon, you have a $25 gift card to Home Depot. You're welcome. Now I'm ready to introduce our speaker. Randy Morgan holds an MS in entomology from the University of Wisconsin. He worked at the Cincinnati Zoo Insectarium for 32 years and is now retired from his position as curator of invertebrates, reptiles, and amphibians. At the zoo, he managed a diverse collection of live insects and other small animals for public educational display and developed world-class exhibits. Randy has been a beekeeper for nearly 40 years, is active in the Southwestern Ohio Beekeepers Association, and loves to share his passion for honeybees and the other little animals that propel and shape our living world. Please give a warm warm welcome to Randy Morgan.
Woo-woo! Wow. Well, thank you so much for coming. It's great to have a large audience here. That's wonderful. So when you say bee, just use the word bee, the insect that almost immediately comes to mind to everyone is the common honeybee, even though there are thousands upon thousands of other types of bees. The common honeybee is the one that comes to most people's minds. This bee is not native to the United States or to the New World, yet has become an incredibly important pollinator throughout the world. So tonight we are going to celebrate the wondrous biology of this insect. It truly is an amazing insect. So this is really a celebration of an amazing social insect. The honey of a bee, fascinating facts from our flower-loving friends. So we're going to start with a little bit of the sadder part of the story. The honeybee has become the sort of the poster child for many of the things that ail insect populations in general, pollinators in general. We've all heard about collapsing honeybee populations. There's a number of interacting stress factors. They're sometimes referred to the 4 Ps. These not only affect honeybees, but they affect other types of native bees, other types of pollinators, and in many cases, insects in general. But if we're talking just about the honeybee now, they are subject to a whole slew of pests, mostly insect pests. Small hive beetles, waxworms, for example. They have a whole host of pathogens that are associated with them. Pesticides are becoming increasingly problematic. Neonicotinoids have been in the news a lot lately. And it's not just the ones that kill them outright, but there's sublethal effects that really have major impacts on the longevity of bees, on their ability to orient through the environment, for example. So even if these pesticides don't kill bees, they can really have negative impacts on them. And then poor nutrition. Most habitats are diminished in some way. Honeybees need flowers, nectar and pollen sources throughout the year, starting in early spring, actually well over a month ago, bees were bringing in pollen from some of the trees. So they need these nectar and pollen sources throughout the years. And when you get some of these impoverished habitats, there's gaps in those food supplies, and that can be problematic for the bees. Did want to call your attention to enemy number 1, varroa mites. And let's see, here's our friend, the common honeybee, and right there is a varroa mite. It's a big ectoparasite. If I was a honeybee, it would be like having a softball size tick on the outside of my body. It sucks bee blood, hemolymph, but worse than that, it suppresses bee immune systems, and it allows some of these pathogens that are normally associated with the bees to have greater impact than they normally would. So that was introduced in the mid 1980s, and it has become a major problem for beekeepers throughout the world. So this is truly enemy number 1. If you have honeybees, you have to deal with varroa mites. And I mention this in part because we're going to talk about varroa mites a little bit later in the talk. You probably have heard about another phrase called colony collapse disorder. This was in the news, well, it was really a few years ago when it was in its prominence. It was really during the period 2003 to 2012 where there was these mysterious die-offs of honeybee colonies. And nobody could figure out why. We still don't know why these colonies died in the way that they did. It disappeared almost as quickly as it started. So colony collapse disorder seems to not be an impact anymore, but it's still used as a catch-all term. So beekeepers still talk about their colonies collapsing. It's usually for other reasons, and it's often due to these varroa mites, which essentially function as dirty hypodermic needles. You know, they feed on one bee, they move to another bee. In the process, they suppress the immune system of that bee and interject or inject some viruses that then have pathological effects on the bees. So that's kind of the negative part of honeybees. This is important to know because honeybees have become indispensable agricultural pollinators throughout the world. About a third of the food we eat is either directly or indirectly pollinated by a single insect, the common honeybee. That's really significant. So the fact that we're having these problems is not a good thing. And there are issues that beekeepers and bee scientists are struggling with all the time. And that's most of the negative things I'm going to say about honeybees right now. Because today really is a celebration of bee biology. And this is what the talk is mainly about today. They're often referred to as social insects. What does that mean? How do they interrelate with flowers? Where do they live on planet Earth? When and what ways have they interacted with us? And how do they sense the world and communicate? So that's the grand plan for today. Does that sound good? Everybody's up for it? Okay. So, this word social is an interesting word because it can be used in a very general way or it can be used in a very specific way. And in fact, many different types of animals are social in some form. And here's just kind of a broad list. Obviously, humans are social, right? You know, we form groups, whether they're relatively primitive towns or very advanced nations, but other primates, dolphins and whales, wolves, birds, fish, and insects, many of them live in groups. Those are societies. So it's fair to say that they're social. But obviously, a troop of monkeys is very different than a flock of birds, is very different than a school of fish or a swarm of insects. So there are different types of societies that we see expressed in various animals. There's some tiny print at the bottom there, social complexity. That's just the way social scientists would look at these and evaluate, you know, is this a simple society or is this a complex society? It has to do with group size. Do individuals specialize on tasks? How do they communicate and how efficiently do they perform as groups? Interestingly enough, the most sophisticated animal societies we know are humans. We are by far the single most socially sophisticated organism on Earth. The next most socially sophisticated organisms, insects. How about that? And I think some of this will become clear to you as we kind of get into this. So remember, we could use that term social in a very general way or in a more specific way. And now we're going to start using it in a much more specific way. We're going to use it, we're going to say the term eusocial. If you wanted to learn a good word for today, that would be a good one to learn. Eusocial, eusociality. It's any living or any animal that exhibits three traits, and there they are: reproductive division of labor, overlapping generations, and cooperative brood care. If you have those three traits, you are a eusocial organism. And I know this can be a little confusing, so we're going to come back to this in subsequent slides and kind of drill down on it a little bit. But this reproductive division, oops, I'm pushing the wrong button there. Reproductive division of labor, there's two castes. You have a reproductive caste and you have a non-reproductive caste, often called the workers, right? Overlapping generations simply means parents and offspring live together. And cooperative brood care simply means you just work together. You know, you efficiently work together. This eusociality occurs in about 29,000 species that we know of on the planet. Most of them are ants and termites, some wasps, some bees, including the honeybee is eusocial, bumblebees, which you probably know about. However, most bees are not social. The vast majority of bees are either solitary or perhaps gregarious. They might live in some sort of simplistic groups, but they're not eusocial. And we do see it in some other animals as well. They're actually eusocial mammals. If you want to see a eusocial mammal, go to the insectarium at the zoo and look at the naked mole rats. There's a queen mole rat and worker mole rats. Now that's kind of weird, but most of the eusocial organisms we know of are insects, and the honeybee is a great example of that. So we're going to drill down on this just a little bit more. Classic example of a eusocial insect is the honeybee. There's a reproductive division of labor. You have a reproductive caste. My earphone just fell off. I'm going to just try this. We have a reproductive caste, which consists of the queens and the drones. They're the ones that reproduce. And you have the non-reproductive caste, or the workers. Again, parents and offspring are living together. You have the mother queen, and the workers are her daughters. So you have parents and offspring. And individuals working together, cooperative brood care, which can involve anything from nest building, foraging for food, colony defense, and that sort of thing. And going back to this idea that there's at least 29,000 different species of eusocial organisms on the planet, we can expect that they're not all the same, right? And you see gradations in there. There are some of those species that would be considered primitively eusocial. Maybe their groups are very tiny. Maybe they live as a queen and a few workers, and that's it. And they have relatively unsophisticated communication systems. So that would be a primitively eusocial organism as opposed to something that's highly eusocial, where you have large populations, elaborate communication systems working together to a high degree. And that certainly includes our friend the honeybee. So now I'm going to see if I can slip this back on here. So eusociality in the common honeybee. First, I want to call attention to this scientific name, Apis mellifera. That's the scientific name of the honeybee. And Apis is the genus, and mellifera is the species. Just like we're Homo sapiens, you know, every living thing has a scientific name. And I wanted to emphasize that here because we're going to talk a little bit more about different races of Apis mellifera and different species of Apis later. So I did want to call your attention to the fact that that's the scientific name of the common honeybee, is Apis mellifera. So that's a good one to file away. So here we have the three different type of bees that you typically would find in a colony. Remember, they fall into a reproductive caste and a non-reproductive caste. So here's your non-reproductive caste, your workers. Anybody who's a worker is basically a non-reproductive individual. And then your reproductives are your queens and your drones. So those are that's your reproductive division of labor right there. And let's just take a closer look at a few of these different individuals that you would find in a colony. The workers, they're unmated females. I actually have the same little chart right here. This makes it a lot easier. They're unmated females. You can have up to 60,000 in a colony, though at certain times of the year, the colony is going to be much smaller than that. They're all daughters of the queen. Queen's the mama. The workers are her daughters, meaning they're all sisters to one another. They specialize on different jobs as they age. This is where that task specialization comes in. There's a whole series of tasks, well over 20 tasks that these individual workers perform. And when they emerge from a cell as a young adult, they're going to focus on one task. You know, maybe they'll do some housekeeping and cleaning used cells. They get a little bit older. They start feeding larger larvae. They get a little bit older yet. They start feeding smaller larvae. They get a little bit older still, and they start foraging, going out for looking for pollen and nectar and so forth. So they task specialize according to their age. So typically a single bee during the summer, who only lives maybe 6 weeks, is going to go through a whole series of tasks that she specializes on according to her age. Really important, they are the decision makers. or at least key decision makers, not the queen. It's really easy for us to be anthropomorphic and put these in you know, our frame of reference for the words that we use, like, oh, the queen's got to be in charge, right? Well, she's not. I mean, she is very important for coordinating many of the activities in the colony. But when it comes to making the really important decisions, the workers do that. And we're gonna give you some really good examples of that later in the talk. In the absence of a queen, they can lay eggs, but those eggs are unfertilized and they automatically become males. And that's a little bit of a kind of a mind bender too, because their sex determination is very different than most mammals or ourselves. You know, we think in terms of like the XX and the XY. Well, they're basically, you know, XX and X. You know, if they have 2 sets of chromosomes, you're automatically a female. If you have 1 set of chromosomes, you're automatically a male. So those males are haploid. The drones are haploid. They have half a set of chromosomes. And so it is possible for a worker to lay an unfertilized egg, and that egg would become a male. But typically that's something that a beekeeper doesn't want to see, but I did want to call your attention to that. The queen, typically 1 queen in the colony, she takes a few mating flights early in her life, and she stores up sperm in a special organ called a spermatheca. And then the rest of her life, which is relatively short, 2-3 years is all a queen would live, and some don't even live that long. These are really, really high energy insects. So the workers during the summertime are only living 6 weeks or so. The queens are only living 1 or 2 years. That's really different than some other social insects. Some ants and termites will have queens that live 20, 30, even 50 years. So these are like the little hummingbirds. They're so energy intense and they just burn out really, really quickly. But she is typically the mother of the group, and she's laying all the eggs. And she has a permanently fixed smooth stinger. That's in contrast to those workers. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later as well. But when those workers sting, they typically eviscerate themselves, which means literally they pull their guts out. That stinger stays in you, and they literally rip their insides out trying to get away, and that stinger continues to sting. And believe it or not, that's adaptive. That's an advantage to this colony. That worker's sacrificing its life on behalf of the colony, but it's marking a beekeeper or a predator and continuing to cause that predator pain, and also putting a little target on them for other bees to follow that scent of venom in to continue. So that's a good example of altruism, where this insect is literally throwing away its life on behalf of the colony. And in reality, losing 1 or even 10 or 20 or 50 workers a day is no big deal, because these things are producing hundreds of, if not thousands of new workers a day during the peak of summertime. So they're literally made to be disposable. The drones, they're adult males. They're typically sons of the queen. If you see a drone inside of a beehive, that's the son of a queen. That queen's already mated. She doesn't need to mate again. So that drone in the colony is never going to mate with that queen. First, it's a bad idea because it's his mom, right? But she's already mated, so his role would be to leave the colony and try to find unmated queens that are out looking to start their own colonies. We already mentioned they form from unfertilized eggs. Typically, they don't contribute to colony labor. They're just sort of hangers-oners. And they don't have stingers. The sting is actually developed from an ovipositor. You heard that word before, ovipositor? How about, have you seen katydids with like a long sword-like thing on the back? Some of you know what I'm talking about. It's like a grasshopper with a long sword-like thing. That's an egg-laying structure. You know, ova means eggs, so it's an ovidepositor, an egg depositor. Well, in bees, that ovipositor has been repurposed, and now it's a venom delivery organ. They lay eggs in another way. So if you're going to have a stinger, you have to be female. And that's pretty much a universal truth throughout the social insects. So any ant that stings you, any wasp that stings you, any bee that stings you, it's got to be a female. Can't sting without an ovipositor, right? All right. So that's kind of a very quick overview of how eusociality is organized in honeybees. Flower power. I think there's a few of us that are in this room who are old enough to remember this phrase from back in the 60s and 70s. It meant something a little bit different than the context we're using it today. I mean, it was a celebration of the times. It was the peace and love generation. So flowers symbolized, the hippie movement, for example. So we're going to check out flower power, but in a little bit different context now. So flower power for us really has to do with flowering plants. There are two things that flowers produce. They produce thunder. I'm sorry. Nectar and pollen. So nectar is just a sweet secretion. There are glands in flowers that produce this dilute sugary substance. It's literally just an attractant. It's a reward. It's saying, come here, whoever you are, whether you're a honeybee or some other type of bee or a butterfly or any other type of potential pollinator. It's like, come here, I'm going to give you this reward. And by the way, while you're here, I'm going to try to get some of my pollen dusted onto your body. So when you go to the next flower to get another reward, you can leave some of that pollen there and fertilize that particular flower. So in nectar, basically you get some fairly standard types of sugar: sucrose, glucose, and fructose. But there can be other types of sugars in there, but they're very basic. I mean, sucrose is basically table sugar. Now pollen, on the other hand, these are the male propagules. They're tiny little sort of ball-like structures that are produced on the anthers, and somehow they have to get to another plant. Well, some flowers are actually self-fertilizing, but somehow that pollen has to get, from the anther that produced it to the stigma that causes that then initiates that flower being fertilized. So from the flower's perspective, it just wants to get fertilized. But from the bee's perspective, that pollen has some really valuable nutrition associated with it. It's typically high in protein. There's also fats and lipids in there, and there's beneficial levels of vitamins, minerals, sterols, and nutraceuticals. But these are basically things that all bees have to have in their diet. So between the two of these, between the nectar and the pollen, this is a complete diet for honeybees and for many other types of bees. The sugary carbohydrates are providing energy, so more of those are going to be used by the adult bees, especially if they're flying and foraging. They're going to burn through a lot of carbohydrates. Whereas the pollen, high in proteins and fats, while used some by the adult bees, are going to be mostly used by the developing larvae, because if you're growing, you need lots of protein, right? And so that's where that really becomes important. So the bottom line is flower power provides complete nutrition for honeybees. So flower-powered foraging. Who remembers this song from the Cowsills? Flowers in her hair. Anybody want to sing a few lines? I've already been told not to sing. Thank you. Really catchy. Woo woo. It was a big hit back in the '67. It is a catchy song. But literally, these are the flower girls. I mean, they've got these multiple branched hairs, and these are all pollen grains, but they're technically flowers, right? So she's got flowers in her hair. Literally flower girls. So this bee, here are her mandibles. Her long tongue is coming out. She's sipping up this sugary reward right here. that's being produced by a nectary gland. Somehow she's gotten these pollen grains all over her body. It just so happens that she's got just a tiny bit of a positive charge on her, designated by these positive charges. And the pollen grains have a tiny, tiny negative charge. So that helps them stick to the bees a little bit more. Although even without that, the hairs are pretty sticky in amongst themselves. Here's a bee that's covered with pollen grains. And as they fly, they groom those. They use some elaborate movements with their legs. They groom those and compact them and try to get most of that pollen into the pollen sac on the hind leg here. So there's a special fringe sort of saddlebag-like structure on her hind legs. So as she flies, she compacts that and she carries that back to the colony. And then once back in the hive, she'll knock that off. And other workers will take it and process it. They'll either eat it directly or stick it into the cells for later. And we'll talk about that as well. Here's her big compound eyes right there, and her antennae, and her little mandibles, her little mouth parts right there. So, flower-powered nest construction. Honeybees are characterized by building waxen nest, hanging, double-sided combs, sort of pendant would be another term for pendant combs, double-sided combs. By definition, that's what honeybees do. They build these double-sided combs. They do it with wax that they produce. Here's a bee turned over on its back. It's got 8 wax glands on the underside of its abdomen. So at a certain time of its life, it's typically going to be a somewhat younger bee, but not a real young bee. Let's just say, a bee that's maybe 2 weeks old at this point. Those wax glands are going to kick into full gear. They're just hanging inside the hive, and they're shedding off these wax glands, and other bees are taking those and fabricating those into the combs. Here's her sting. She's mad. She's mad the fact that some big goofy guy has gently pinched her there, so she'd like to sting me, but she's not able to do that. So typically our honeybees are cavity nesters. So hollow trees would be where they would naturally nest. Perhaps in hollow cavities, if there's an earth embankment with a pre-existing hollow cavity. So that's typically where Apis mellifera is going to nest. So here's a typical, you get these multiple parallel combs, double-sided. Occasionally you'll get them built in an exposed area. Typically that happens when a swarm settles down and is not able to find a place to move to in time, and they start building comb there, and then they're stuck. And if it's in a more northern area like here, they really have a tough time surviving the winter. Now, if they did this in a tropical area, and it's conceivable that they would do this in a tropical area, even though they would prefer to be in a cavity, then they have a chance of surviving in a spot like that. So the brood rearing and the colony growth are all powered by flowers, either directly or indirectly. So you have 3 sort of main developmental stages of the immature bees. You have eggs, you have larvae, which are technically like grubs or caterpillars, and then a pupa, and then the adults. Same life cycle as a butterfly, for example. So the queen bee is laying these little rod-like eggs. Here's one that's quite enlarged. But if you look down in the bottom of the cell, there's a little finger-like egg sticking up from each cell. After 3 days, those hatch into larvae, and the larvae are like a caterpillar in a butterfly, for example. That's the feeding stage, although they're not crawling around. They're confined in these cells, and at first they're being fed royal jelly, which is secreted by these glands inside the worker bees' mouths. A worker bee of a certain age, right, is going to have its mandibular glands are going to be in, you know, in full go mode at that point in time and secreting royal jelly. And so these young larvae are literally swimming in it, and that's all they eat. It's very, very nutritious, you know, high protein, high nutrient. And then if a larva is destined to be a queen, it's going to be fed royal jelly throughout its life. But these are all worker larvae here. So when they're about half grown, they're going to be switched over to pollen. And that actually slows them down a little bit, and they end up becoming workers instead of queens. And then finally, once these larvae are mature, and these are mature larvae here. They're literally filling the cell. At that point, they might spin a little bit of a silk cap in preparation to pupate. But then the bees come along and cap that over with a wax, and I'm going to say a propolis mix. Propolis is basically a glue that bees use. So the workers are sealing, these are all mature larvae, they're sealing these caps over. So this is referred to as sealed brood. Okay. So there you have it, the 3 life stages of the immature bee. So flower-powered food storage. So these colonies are perennial. That means they have the potential to live year after year after year. In theory, a honeybee colony is immortal because it can requeen itself. Now, of course, that doesn't actually work in reality because there's a lot of not only, you know, pests and predators potentially impacting these, but accidents and that sort of thing as well. So nothing is immortal, but they have that potential to be so. But at the very least, they're perennial. So it's conceivable, and it's known that some bee colonies have existed for 50 or more years in the same hollow tree. That's gone through a whole series of queens during that time. And they're able to do that in part because they store up pollen. And here's their beautiful wax and comb. Now there's some nectar in here as well, but all this yellow is pollen that's being temporarily stored. And typically that's going to be stored near the brood because remember that's what those young larvae really need, those proteins and vitamins and minerals. So a lot of times that pollen is going to be stored right next to the brood. And then we have honey, which is being stored above the brood nest and to the sides. And it starts off being relatively dilute. Because remember that nectar, it's a very dilute, sugary material. The bees are collecting it. They're carrying that honey back home in their crop, which is an organ in their digestive system, but it's before the stomach, so it doesn't get digested. So basically, the bee sips that nectar. It's carried in this sort of pseudo-stomach, and then she gets back to the colony. She can regurgitate that to a nest mate, or she can regurgitate it into a cell, into a waxen cell. But during that process, during the time that it's in that crop, there's already some enzymatic conversions that are being done to those sugars. So those sugars are, you remember it started off with a lot of fructose and glucose and sucrose. Well, it's being converted to these other sugars, levulose and dextrose. Not obviously important to remember those terms, but these are much more stable configurations of that sugar, and they're also able to release energy very quickly. So when the bees go back in, and if they want to eat this honey, that levulose and dextrose can be converted into energy very, very quickly. And then there's a bunch of minor, diverse, and really highly complex sugars in there as well, but it's mostly just those few. But once that honey is ripe, and so it has very, very low water contact, then they put this wax capping over the top of it. And that's really stable material. Once those sugars are converted, enzymatically converted, and capped over with wax, in theory, they can last many, many years. I heard that some honey was found in some Egyptian tomb somewhere and that it was good. I can't imagine it was that good, but I'd try it. So flower-powered thermoregulation. So this is, there are lots of things about honeybees that impress me and that I think are just wonderful, but this is one of the top 5. The ability of these things to control their environment inside their colony, and particularly the temperature inside the colony. So within that colony, within those combs, there's an area for brood, right? There's area for pollen, there's area for honey. But wherever that brood is, however small it is, however large, typically there's a period in late winter where there's no brood, but around the middle of January or so, that queen starts laying eggs, and that brood starts expanding during the early part of the summer. So right now, there are actually young bees emerging inside these colonies, even though there is not nectar and available to them in nature. But wherever that brood is, that's kept at a stable temperature. 91 to 94 degrees Fahrenheit year round. So a good 10 months out of the year, there's brood. Typically there's brood in these colonies. And they're doing that sort of in two great ways. If it's warm out, the colony is relatively diffuse in there. There's lots of air circulation. If it's hot out, they'll actually fan their wings. They'll bring in water droplets and spread it across the surfaces of these combs and evaporate it, so you get evaporative cooling. It's like a swamp cooler. Conversely, if it's cold out, or really cold out, the bees form a cluster, which is basically a big ball of bees. And the outer parts of that cluster are compacted. They compact their bodies in really tight. So there's a shell-like effect associated with this cluster. And the inner part of the cluster is a little bit more diffuse. And bees are moving around in there, vibrating their wing muscles and generating heat. And so here's sort of a cross-section of a cluster. So right here in the middle of the cluster is where all the brood is right now. 91, 92 degrees Fahrenheit. As long as the bees are healthy, you've got a relatively large cluster, so hopefully your bees went into winter with a nice population, but most importantly, they have honey for energy. If they don't have enough honey, or if they run out of honey, this story is over, right? But as long as they have honey, it can be 20 below zero out. And if you put a thermometer into the center of that cluster, 91, 92 degrees Fahrenheit, that's pretty cool, don't you think? It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. So this is the time of year right now, even though they're starting to get a few flowers and stuff, beekeepers are really making sure that, or good beekeepers are really making sure that their hives have adequate honey stores on them, and if they don't, they're feeding them sugar syrup or some other kind of food, because right now you've got these expanding brood nests, and you get a freezing night and you don't have enough honey to fuel that temperature and keep that brood warm, you lose your colony. So they sort of function as a warm-blooded animal. That brood has to be kept at 92, 93 degrees Fahrenheit. Even down to 70, it'll kill. Most insects would be fine at 70, 60 degrees for a few days. It'll kill honeybee brood. So amazing ability to regulate their internal environment of their colony. So I mentioned at the beginning that honeybees are not native to the United States. A lot of people, this thing is not working. Oh, look at that. Where were you when I was doing wardrobe? I'm just going to go like this. So, so honeybees are not native to the New World. They're Old World only. Here's my attractive young assistant. And remember at the beginning, we talked about the scientific name for the common honeybee, Apis mellifera. Thank you. There are other species of honeybees, and we're gonna show you a few of those right now. Honeybee taxonomists aren't in complete agreement with how many species of honeybees there are, just because within species there's tremendous variability, but there are at least 7 species of honeybees. And some people feel that there's over a dozen species of different types of honeybees. Again, we only work with Apis mellifera, at least in North America. Something about Apis mellifera stood out from the other species of Apis. They're all originally native to tropical Asia. For some reason, Apis mellifera radiated out of tropical Malaysia and diversified and adapted to a bunch of different habitats, possibly associated with the fact that it's a cavity nester, although there are other species of cavity nesters in Apis that didn't do that. But for whatever reason, Apis diversified throughout the old world. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But here are four common, well-established species. We got Apis mellifera, that's our common honeybee. It's sometimes called the common honeybee, Western honeybee, European honeybee. It's now kept globally for pollination, honey, wax, and propolis. That's that glue we talked about. There's another species of Apis called Apis cerana, Oriental Eastern Asian hive bee. That's also managed in hives just like Apis mellifera, although it's not quite as good of a honey producer, so it's being phased out. And we have 2 others, Apis florea and Apis dorsata. These cannot be kept in hives, but they are hunted locally. And I wanted to just kind of show you a couple of these because they're interesting. So this is Apis cerana. It's the closest relative of mellifera, of our honeybee, Apis mellifera. Here's sort of a size comparison. Here's Apis mellifera, here's Apis cerana, it's a little bit later. So here we are in tropical Asia, and these are all hives that are being kept by local beekeepers that have Apis cerana in there. Again, not quite as good of a honey producer, so beekeepers people who have businesses in general want good productivity, right? So Apis cerana is being phased out a little bit and replaced by Apis mellifera. Well, here's the problem with that. Humans moved Apis mellifera into Apis cerana habitat. Apis cerana happened to be the native host of Varroa. And so that Varroa mite jumped from its host species of bee, which it was perfectly adapted to, and which didn't kill off its host species of bee. It jumped onto mellifera, and then beekeepers moved mellifera out, really not thinking about it. And now we have Varroa mites literally all over the world. And they're problematic. So the Varroa mite came from a closely related species of bee. A couple of fun things though about Apis cerana. It is attacked by these giant oriental hornets. These are sort of these big yellow-headed hornets. And there's sort of 2 scenarios. When those hornets find a colony and they start raiding it, those Apis cerana want to try to ball those scouts. So here's a scout hornet coming in. These things will just decimate a colony. But if the first few scouts come in and are balled by these honeybees, basically making a little swarm cluster on the bees, they raise the temperature in that swarm and they kill off that giant Japanese hornet. They literally fry it. If they're not able to do that and those scouts get back to their colony and recruit additional hornets back to that, then it's just decimation. So this is the best scenario for Apis cerana, is to kill off those first few scouts by balling and turning up the heat. So another really interesting type of honeybee is Apis dorsata, the giant honeybee. These things are half again as big as Apis mellifera, really a striking color pattern on them. And these make single comb nests. And they make nests that hang in the open. So very different than mellifera. Mellifera makes multiple combs within cavities. This makes single combs, always hanging in exposed locations. And in many cases, they'll put a bunch of nests in the same area. So here are a bunch of these colonies, all in the same tree. Each one of these has a queen and tens of thousands of workers. They're all pretty aggressive if disturbed. There are different ways that you could measure, how deadly or how dangerous an insect is. I mean, really, mosquitoes that vector malaria are probably amongst the worst, most dangerous organisms on Earth because of all the, people that die from malaria every year. But in terms of something that can really do a number on you right now, this is probably the most dangerous insect on the planet. Because if you're like an entomologist like me walking around and, oh man, look at all those giant honeybees up there. I'm gonna throw a rock, see if I can stir them up. One colony goes into alarm, those pheromones spread, and all those colonies go into alarm. And all of a sudden, you literally have hundreds of thousands of angry bees stinging anything that moves. That is definitely not something to be messed with. Yet some people hunt these things. So same species that nest on rocky cliffs, and some of the indigenous folks in Nepal actually smoke them and climb up these very, it looks sort of risky rope ladders and harvest the honey. So there's a high risk job for you. So we mentioned that Apis mellifera is native to the Old World, and that at some point in its life history, it migrated out of the tropics and ended up over long periods of time, of course, ended up in Africa and Europe, and in each of those locations, it became adapted to those particular climates that it was associated with. And so it literally formed 24 or more distinct geographic races. So you could call these subspecies, you could call them geographic races. They have common names, and here are just a few of them. The German honeybee, Italian honeybee, Russian honeybee. They're all Apis mellifera, but there's a third name which designates the subspecies of the race. So the German honeybee is Apis mellifera mellifera. Italian honeybee, Apis mellifera ligustica, and so forth. All the same species. An analogy would be, all dogs are the same species, right? But there's a lot of different breeds or races, and they're very, very different from one another. Of course, that was a result of artificial selection by humans. This is a result of natural selection, but it's still kind of the same idea. These races, in some cases, are very, very different from one another. They're physiologically different from one another. Not only the bees might be different colors, but they might be slightly different sizes. Some might be better honey producers. Some might be better at overwintering. Some might be more aggressive or less aggressive, and so forth. They have traits associated with their particular breeds. The German honeybee was actually the first one brought over by some of the early colonizers to the U.S. And that was a decent honey producer, but I think it produces lots of propolis, which was considered to be less desirable. Some propolis is good, but too much propolis. There goes my ear thing again. All right, we're going this route. Yeah, I'll just hold this. That's okay. So it wasn't too long before the Italian honeybee was brought over, and that's typically the bee that we have in this country today, although you can find some of these other races here as well. But Italian honeybees are commonly kept in this country. Russian honeybee is starting to gain a little favor here because it appears to have some resistance to varroa mite, for example. You've heard of the so-called Africanized bees or killer bees, right? The kind of the infamous bee. So how that happened, in East Africa, there's a honeybee called Apis mellifera scutellata. So that's a naturally occurring race of honeybees. It's in East Africa. It's a harsh environment. They have to deal with things like honey badgers. If you know honey badgers, they're like a Wolverine on steroids, a really, really tough predator to deal with. They have elephants to deal with, and they have humans to deal with there. If you're going to be a honeybee in East Africa and survive, you've got to be really, really, really aggressive. And that's how they developed that predisposition. They're also fairly decent honey producers. So some entomologists back in the 1950s thought, well, maybe we can bring some of these East African honeybees down into Brazil and South America, where we had a lot of Italian honeybees, which happened to be adapted for Italy, right? Sort of a northern temperate climate. So they weren't doing that well in a tropical habitat. So let's bring in these East African bees, maybe hybridize them and see what we get. Well, they weren't supposed to escape, but they did. And that hybrid strain, which is now Apis mellifera ligustica times scutellata, it's a hybrid strain of honeybees, retained all of its aggressive traits, and it escaped and spread very quickly. And it has other undesirable traits for beekeeping. And so now we have Africanized honeybees in much of the New World, and particularly in tropical and subtropical areas. And it's a tough bee to work with just because it's so aggressive, but that's where that one came from. So the relationship between bees and humans has been a long one. Certainly early people were not keeping bees, but basically just hunting them. So one of the earliest records comes from Tanzania, where there are cave paintings that show people actually hunting honeybees. They were probably harvesting them certainly for their honey, but perhaps eating the brood as well, that sort of thing. More recently in the now Turkey area, pots had beeswax in it. But it wasn't until several thousand years ago, 3,000 years ago in the now Israel area, and then a little bit more recently in the now Egypt area, we know people were actually keeping bees. And they were keeping them in straw skeps or clay pots, fairly simplistic types of hives, but essentially they were cavities, right, that the bees would be happy to live in. I like well, they were brought to America by the European pilgrims. Remember, that was the German honeybee that was first brought over, and then later the Italian bee. Some of the early American Indians referred to them as the white man's fly. I'm not sure that was a compliment. But a major event happened in 1851. This Langstroth hive was invented. Now, the guy that invented it was named Reverend Langstroth. He actually invented it when he was living in Philadelphia, but shortly thereafter, he moved to Oxford, Ohio. And there's actually a little building up in Oxford, Ohio that commemorates Langstroth and the development of this Langstroth hive. So I think that's kind of cool. But that revolutionized beekeeping, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But throughout this history of, tens of thousands of years ago, this honeybee is only being hunted and then progressively kept in some simplistic hives. The Langstroth hive was invented in the mid-1800s, revolutionized beekeeping, made it relatively easy to keep beekeeping. And as an offshoot of that, today, our friend Apis mellifera, the common honeybee, it's not too strong of a word to say this is an essential managed agricultural pollinator. I mean, it is absolutely essential. We've become sort of aligned with this bee because we can manipulate it, we can manage it. You know, we can keep it in apiaries, we can move it places that need to be pollinated, and today a good third of our food is pollinated by this single species. So its fate is our fate, and perhaps vice versa. So America is well known for inventing lots of things. Maybe not famous for inventing the Langstroth hive, but I think it should be. Because this really, truly revolutionized beekeeping. In the good old days, well, we mentioned clay pots and that type of thing, you know, back in Turkey and in Egypt. More recently, straw skeps and these hollow logs served as nice cavities, but to harvest the honey required destructive sampling. You open that up, all the combs are glued in there, and if you want to cut things out, you do some damage. And if you're a little too rough, you destroy the colony. But our friend Reverend Langstroth made an observation that bees honored a space that's roughly 3/8 of an inch. It's actually just a little bit more narrow than that. It's called bee space. And so bees tend to not fill in that space with propolis or bridge it with burr comb, which is wax. So wherever you have bee space, the bees tend to honor that. So he built this hive based entirely on the concept of bee space. So between all of these combs here, between these frames and these wooden combs, there's bee space. Now, yeah, the bees will fill in a few places, but by and large, now a beekeeper can go in with his hive tool, clean away the tiny little bit of burr comb that's there, and pull those frames out. Likewise, the space between all these elements, these are honey supers and hive bodies, but there's bee space between the top of these frames and the bottom of the overhead structure. There's bee space there. So it really has created a situation where you now have a modular hive that you can manage and do all kinds of things with. You can tear that thing apart, pull out all the frames, inspect everything, harvest some honey, harvest propolis, and then put everything back together, and the colony should go along just fine. So really an important development. See how we doing? Okay. The ins and outs of the common honeybee. Just wanted to show you this to emphasize the fact that these are actually very, very complex organisms. In fact, insects in general are complex. Sometimes I think there's a little bit of a tendency, oh, it's just a bug, it's just a simple organism. Just a cockroach, it's just simple. There's not too much to it. Well, in reality, insects are very complex. You know, they've got complex nervous systems, digestive systems, muscular systems, and so on and so forth. Brain is not particularly huge. Maybe only about 1 million neurons or brain cells. Well, that sounds pretty good. You know, million sounds pretty good. But pales in comparison to 100 billion that most of you have. I probably don't have quite that many, but 100 billion nerve cells is really vastly, vastly different than 1 million. So they have certain types of intelligence, but they don't have intelligence like we're intelligent. And I personally believe that they're not self-aware. Nonetheless, they do amazing things. See, here's that crop we talked about. So if they sip in nectar, it can be stored there and regurgitated. But once it passes out of that crop into the rest of the digestive tract, then it gets digested at that point. Sting, there's a poison gland. Basically, the idea is these things are very, very sophisticated little organisms, but not particularly brilliant. Let's just talk a little bit about the ability of these things to perceive their environment. And I've always been fascinated by this graphic. So these bees have these compound eyes, thousands of facets, and you think, well, with compound eyes like that, they must be able to see really well. Their vision does not compare to our ability to discriminate fine details. So for a honeybee, everything on that top line essentially looks the same, as everything on that second line looks the same. They can't tell the difference. And there's been a lot of people that have tested this, and you can set up artificial flowers and get them to go to lures and make comparisons of what they can perceive and what they can't. But any object on the upper line can be differentiated from any object on the lower line. So it really has to do with how broken an image is. I've had beekeepers tell me that, oh, my bees recognize me. They can recognize me individually. I don't think so. We're all just kind of bumps on a log to them. We'd all look exactly the same. Now, maybe if you wore a certain deodorant or maybe your mannerisms a little bit, they might key in on that, but no, they just don't have that fine discriminating ability that our vision has. The color spectrum is interesting as well. They do see a fairly full color spectrum, but it's shifted. Whereas we can see the color red, they can't. And they can see ultraviolet, reflected ultraviolet light, but we cannot. That's kind of interesting. But there are flowers, for example, that have ultraviolet markings on the petals that are called honey guides. And if we look at the flower, you don't see anything there. But if a bee looks at the flower, there would be markings indicating where they would go to find the nectar reward. So that's kind of neat. So if you're a social organism, any kind of social organism, you have to communicate with your group mates in order to be effective. And for many types of animals, there are certain signals or smells that are given off. A growl, baring teeth, putting your ear back. These are all signals. But in social insects, in particular, they use pheromones. These are chemical signals. Now, there are other animals that use pheromones as well. They're pretty broadly used in the insect world. But social insects, the eusocial insects, really take these to the extreme. And their bodies are literally covered with glands. There are glandular openings along the sides of their body, into their mouth cavities, into their excretory systems. So when these chemicals are expressed, either individually or sometimes in groups, they literally give messages to their nestmates. The queen, for example, is putting off a substance called queen substance that identifies her. Isn't that amazing? That identifies her as a queen. Again, remember, these bees don't have good visual ability. They're inside this dark hive. They're walking around in there using their antennae. Oh, you're a worker. Oh, you're a worker. Oh, you're the queen. Yeah. And so they might treat the queen differently. They'd be more inclined to offer her food or groom her, for example. Alarm is also expressed chemically. So when bees get alarmed, they give off an alarm pheromone, and that goes in the air, and any bee that encounters that is more likely to react aggressively to that. Here's the bee that has literally left its stinger behind in my skin, and it's eviscerating itself. That bee is going to die, maybe not right away, but this is still an adaptation for the colony, because I'm continuing to get stung even though I've brushed that bee away, and that venom is continuing to volatilize and marking me, so other bees are more likely to come in and sting that site. So that's actually a positive adaptation for the bees, because they can make more workers quite readily, right? Another example is this gland here is being exposed. It's basically, bring it on home, girls. This is where you're supposed to be. You just follow this scent in and you'll find home. So one really unique language that the bees use is called the dance language, or the waggle dance. How many people have heard of that? A few of you have. This is really special about bees. So this comes back to another one of those, for me, holy smokes, I can't believe these animals, these insects are actually able to do this. So it's basically a dance. It's a ritualized behavior that has a tremendous amount of information in it. Sometimes referred to the 3 Ds, the distance, direction, desirability of a food source. So here we have a worker who's found a food source. Could be a mile away, could be 2 miles away, could be to the west, could be the east. And she has the ability to communicate that information to her sisters. They may have never been to that location before, but that successful forager, that successful scout can communicate to her sisters, you know, you need to fly this direction for this far, and this is the type of food that you're going to find there. That's pretty amazing. So how the heck would they do that? There are 2 different reference points. If you're inside the colony, gravity is your main reference point. If you're outside the colony, the sun is your main reference point. And just kind of as a preview, so here's outside the colony. So, you know, here's the food source, here's the sun, here's the colony. You have to fly this far in this angle to the sun. Well, inside the hive, they're doing the dance at that same angle, but now relative to gravity and not the sun. Does that make sense? It's like, it's just crazy amazing that they switch from one reference point to another. Hopefully this will make it a little bit more clear. Let's back up here. Okay. So here's the bee doing the waggle dance. Boop, boop, boop. And that's a typical dance. They loop one way, then there's a straight run, then they loop the other way. So whatever that angle to gravity is, it means fly that same angle relative to the sun, wherever it is. So here's the hive. Outside the food source is 30 degrees to the right of the sun. Inside the colony, this straight run is 30 degrees to the right of straight up. And the duration of this dance is proportional to the distance that they need to fly. Even more impressive, it's proportional to the energy that it takes to fly that distance. So it takes into account things like headwinds and tailwinds, which is really amazing. So the bee, the successful forager comes back, starts to dance on the comb, catches the attention of some of her nestmates. They fall in behind her, and they start mimicking that dance. So there'll be the straight run, well, she'll be, you know, it'll be for a certain duration of time, and the follower bees will start to mimic that. And then they'll loop to the right, then they'll do that straight run again, and they'll loop to the left. And maybe they follow them 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 times. But at some point, that follower bee, not literally, but kind of goes, aha, I get it. I know which direction and how far I need to fly to get to that food source. Pretty darn amazing. So the last thing we're going to talk about is swarming, and this is really one of those again, probably top amazing things about honeybees for me. So reproduction occurs on 2 levels. You have individual reproduction, so you're making new workers or new drones or even new virgin queens within your colony. So new individuals are being reproduced. But you have this second level of reproduction where you have new colonies that need to be produced. So you have to have the individual reproduction followed by colony level reproduction, and that's mostly what we're talking about here. So To make that happen, first you have to rear new queens, new unmated queens. It starts with these special little hanging cells. These are called queen cups. If it's time to make a queen, you'll get an egg laid in there, and in a fairly short period of time, that cell will be drawn out into this large peanut shape and sealed. And so that particular larva has been fed royal jelly her whole life. She's 10, 20, 30% bigger than a worker, but she develops in quite a few days less than a worker. It's that nutritious. And then these queens emerge. One or more queens emerge. Before, typically in swarming, here's a virgin or unmated queen coming out. Typically, part of the colony is going to leave with the original mother queen before that happens. So the swarming process, making a new colony, first you make new queens. Then you make sort of a temporary daughter colony, a temporary cluster. You take the old queen with you. She's shrunk down. She hasn't been laying eggs for a while. Her abdomen has actually shrunk down a little bit. She's able to fly. The workers come swarming out. There's a big pheromone cloud. Queen goes along. She's not leading, right? The queen's just following with the workers. And they make a swarm cluster. So here's some hives back here, and you get these big tornadoes of bees that come out, and then they'll settle in a cluster like this, or here, or all kinds of crazy places. And they usually settle close to the parental colony. So the old queen is with that cluster. So the old colony now has new virgin queens coming out, which have to mate and then settle down to business. So they should be okay. But these swarm clusters have a challenge. They need to find a place to live. And this is where I think this is one of the absolute most amazing things about honeybees right here. So you get roughly 200 scout bees. These are older bees that are familiar with the territory. They're flying out in all directions and looking for hollow cavities. And those individual bees are going into these cavities and making some kind of an evaluation. How high above ground? Is it dry? Is it sunny? Are there ants? That sort of thing. And they go back to the swarm cluster and they use the waggle dance as a form of debate. And these things literally have a debate where they're saying, hey, I found this site. If I think it's really good, I'm going to dance enthusiastically. Other scouts who have already found their own sites are going to go and look at those new sites that they've just been informed of and make a comparison with the sites that they already know. And it's about the best example of what politics really should be like. Nobody has an agenda. You know, it's all for what is best for the colony. And at some point, they are all dancing in unison. And at that point, the colony has made a decision. Again, this decision is being made by the workers, not the queen. The queen's just sitting there. And when the decision has been made, then those scout bees start jostling the workers in that swarm cluster and making little peeping noises and waking them up. And they warm their wing muscles up. And when it's time, the whole swarm lifts off. And those scout bees, which have agreed upon the new site, then use pheromone trails in the air to kind of lead the rest of the swarm to the new site. And they move on in. And I think that's just absolutely amazing that a decision of that magnitude is made by these honeybee swarms. And that is the end of the talk.
Does anyone have any questions?
I'm hoping we have at least one question. Yes.
Hold on just a second.
Oh, thank you.
Do they do shifts and let some of the bees sleep, or to work all around the whole 24 hours?
Individual bees will go through sort of quiescent periods. So I guess in that sense, yeah, everything needs a break, right? It's really hard to just be sort of metabolically revved up all the time. So yes, individual bees are going to have downtime. And of course, night's going to be a little more quiet than the day. I mean, there's not going to be foraging at night and that sort of thing. So yeah, good question though. Yeah, they take breaks.
Any other questions?
Oh, here, she'll bring the mic over.
It's not really a question, but I was fascinated with bees a while back, and my daughter didn't have anything to do one summer, and I bought some honey at Jungle Gyms. They sell it at Kroger's, but it's called Don Pop's honey, and I'm sure people see it. So there was a phone number on there, and I decided that I'm going to call them to see if we can go out there and see it. Well, lo and behold, in August, I think it's August 5th or 6th, he has what he calls a customer appreciation. And they have hot dogs for everybody, but he has demonstrations how they harvest the honey, how they take it out of the comb and centrifuge it to sell it. And he actually has hives you can actually in glass where you can see the queen bee and all that. It's really fascinating. It's free to the public too, but they have a website. It's Don Pop's honey. So
okay, well that was a good promotion for Don there, wasn't it?
yeah.
Yeah. While I'm thinking of it, just one sec. I've got a friend and colleague in the back, the guy with the cap. He's got a little observation hive, not with live bees in it, with photos of bees. So, you know, on your way out, if you want to check out what he's got and talk with him a little bit, you get a little bit of a sense of how a Langstroth hive is actually organized from that.
Could I ask about ground bees, or what I think are termed ground bees, where they burrow in the ground, but they're very aggressive. And if you're walking across a field, which my daughter had at one time, and she was attacked by those to the point now that if she's even walking by where there's a lot of bees, she can start to hyperventilate. So I'm wondering, do they actually produce honey, or what are they?
Those are most likely yellow jacket wasps that you're talking about. The challenge with common names is that they can be used interchangeably to mean different things, and there are in fact a number of bees that will nest in the ground and could be called ground bees, but your description of them being very aggressive would really suggest yellow jackets, which are a type of wasp. They're eusocial wasps, and so they'd be related to like hornets and wasps. Would live in colonies, and there'd be a queen and workers, and many yellow jackets do nest in the ground, and they have a very strong defensive response. So if you disturb them, they'll let you know they're there. Generally, no, perhaps only incidentally, but they are nectivorous, so and carnivorous. So they're going to take insect prey, and they might scavenge on carcasses. If they go to a flower, it's possible that they would pick up pollen and transfer it, but they tend to be smooth-bodied, so they're really not well adapted for transferring pollen. So I wouldn't rank them high as pollinators.
Can I ask just one more? Now, is there a way to desensitize someone who has been attacked by the bees and now has this allergic reaction to them? Have they developed some way to help these people?
Seeing allergists, yeah, my understanding is there are treatments that one can go through that probably, I mean, you start with very, very low doses of venom exposure and build up. That's my understanding. So seeing an allergist could very likely help with that. Or you could just become a beekeeper and you get stung all the time, and then you don't have to worry about it.
If bees were not native to North America, how was the pollination done?
Oh, well, thank you. The honeybee, that particular species, Apis mellifera, is not native to North America. We have a huge cohort of native bees. that historically was here. The bumblebees, the little fuzzy and black and yellow bees, that's actually a eusocial bee. Those are native here. And then there's a whole slew of solitary bees or gregarious bees. Tens of thousands of species of bees, different types of bees that are closely associated with flowering plants and historically were the main pollinators of flowering plants in North America. So plants were being pollinated just fine well before honeybees were ever brought here.
Anyone else with a question?
Could you just tell us a little bit about mason bees?
I'm going to let Jim talk about that. You want to tell us? Come up here and tell us about. This is like Mr. Mason bee right here. Bring. He's got a little nest box with. Got one of those little nest boxes. Yep. But there are things that you can do to encourage native bees or solitary bees and that type of thing. So I'm gonna, since Jim's got a box here and he's been researching it, I'm gonna let him.
Mason bees. Well, those are just one of the many different, as Randy was referring to, many of the different kinds of solitary bees or gregarious bees that we have in the area. There's an estimated 400 to 450 different kinds or species of bees. One of those bees is referred to as the mason bee. I just recently got some of these. I've been trying different kinds of mason bee houses. Anyone else heard about mason bees and how you can attract them to your garden for pollination? They're gaining in popularity. And there's one specific species called the blue orchard bee, which is even being looked at as a possible alternative pollinator to the honeybee. And they are native. So the reason they're called mason bees, quite simply, is they are masons. And rather than living, I'm gonna put the nest down here, and that's filled with all these different tubes. Now in the natural environment, that would be different kinds of reeds or holes in dead trees. And what the mason bee does, they are solitary, which means they do not live in a colony like the honeybee. So every female is basically a queen bee. She's going to lay eggs, and she can, just like the honeybee, she can determine the sex of what that bee is going to be, whether a male or a female. So what they do is they collect nectar and pollen, just like a honeybee. They will find a good place to nest. Might be in one of these tubes if you put one out in your backyard. But the important thing is that you have to be close to a source of mud. Because what they do, and when they bring the pollen in and the nectar, and they'll wrap it around an egg, and then they will go out and get mud. They have very big mandibles. And they'll bring that mud in, and they'll crawl in head first and build a wall. And that becomes the chamber. So then they start another one, and you will see if we had one all the way filled up, you would see, and we opened it up, you would see little chambers of the pupa, and they turn into cocoons, and they overwinter as cocoons, kind of like, again, like a butterfly. And now they're just starting to hatch. I saw some today because we got the warmer temperatures today. Typically they would be out by now, but because of this late spring we've been having. And I said they can determine the sex when they lay the egg. The females will be back. This one actually open, but if using this as example, if they were to nest here, the females would be towards the back. The males would be towards the front. When they're finished with the tube, you'll see some mud on the end of it. So why females in the back, males in the front? Anybody have any ideas? Which ones are going to come out first? The ones in the front. We want the males out first so they can pollinate the females, so the females can start the process again, laying eggs and building the walls. Also, it's been said that males are more dispensable than females I don't know about that, but that could be part of it too.
I'm pretty sure that's true.
So there are, and I mentioned the blue orchard bee, and I even recently heard that even in the almond farms in California, Randy knows this, that what is it, like 90% of the world's supply of almonds comes from farms in California.
California, and it's mostly
Yes.
honeybee pollinated.
Yes, I mean, the honeybee is too big to fail there, and they've been experimenting with the blue orchard bees. And the latest I've heard is they have not achieved success just yet because, well, a number of reasons, but you got to have that mud. That mud has to be there.
But this is something that you could do. I mean, a number of places sell these either online or in nature stores. So if you're at all interested in bees, this is something that you could really easily do. You know, put it up in your yard and observe it.
And another good thing about it is also, although they do have a stinger, they seldom use it. Because they're not defending the colony, they're not defending a honey source, food source, they are not aggressive. I literally put my face right up there.
Yeah, the solitary bees are really, really non-aggressive. So, yeah. So we're probably, yeah.
We are out of time
Yeah,
for
we're out of time.
questions. You could maybe talk to the guys afterwards, but I like that newbie, not having to worry about the stinger. I just want to mention this class happened tonight because of one of our attendees brought this to our attention. I don't know if that person's here tonight or not. I don't think so. But anyway, just mentioning that. So if you have any ideas about anything, that's how a lot of our classes happen, is you telling us about these kinds of things. Randy, thank you so much. That was very interesting. Coming in, I knew they made honey and I knew they stung.
Ooh, thank you. Wow. Thank you. Good audience. Well, thanks. That's the only time I've worn a bee beard. That was like 25 years